we look at some research paper about the link of inflation expectation with economic news and inflation expectation with the economic diseases. So the first paper, we look at the consumer attitude and the inflation expectation by Efrana, Hamza, and Santo. And the question here, the research question here, how do consumers form inflation expectation? One more time, how do you form inflation expectation? Now we look at some regression analysis. And what are the role of consumer attitudes and attention to economic news about the formation of inflation expectation? So in this paper, they use the data from the University of Michigan surveys of consumer expectation from 1980 to 2011, because this paper they published in 2012, 17, yeah, but it takes some time for the process of to publish the paper, so we use data from 1980 to 2011, and the bias of consumer inflation expectation in how they measure it, the bias here. In the last paper, we look at the difference between inflation expectation with the realized inflation, right? And in this paper, they not only look at the difference between inflation expectation with the realized inflation, but also with the professional forecaster, so that we can see the difference or the forecast area from the consumer expectation. And we assume that professional forecaster the expectation is correct. And the consumer attitudes here refer to the major financial situation and the macroeconomy like employment expectation. So the attitudes about now it's good time to make major purchases like car, house, vehicles, or what to think about the financial situation is less challenge, whether it's better or it was off. And consumer news attention here, they use two data sets. The first one from the Michigan survey, the respondents in the Michigan survey, they report whether they have recently heard news about price or price change. Yeah. So they have questioned the answer, have you heard any recent news about price change, whether price increase or decrease? In the Michigan survey, they have one question to measure the news attention. And another measurement of news coverage related to the inflation news in the New York Times and the Washington Post. So here is the two popular newspapers in the US, and they measure the intensity of news coverage regarding to inflation in this newspaper. So it means that in the New York Times and Washington Post, if it's more practical about inflation, it means that the media now they talk more about inflation, right? And actually, there is another indicator of news attention about inflation that we also can use Google Trends for the people search as well. It also reflects how people pay attention and they want to know more about inflation. For example, if we look at the Google Trends for the how frequently people search for some keywords like inflation, price levels, and so on. In this paper, they look at the newspaper in the New York Times and in the Washington Post. But by the way, if we want to study this topic for Vietnam, for example, so which newspaper do you think that is the most popular in Vietnamese population nowadays?
The Express. I
Express?
read the Express, which is like not very. Nhưng quá ba chạy.
TikTok, Facebook.
The Facebook is the social media.
That is, I mean also most is social media.
Yeah. Yeah, Facebook is quite popular in Vietnam, but nowadays I think in advanced economy like in Germany, not so many people will use Facebook. They use
What's that?
Twister and Ice now. Yeah, it's more popular than this. Yes, so here in this paper they study about the linguistic language of Chinese and Boston. So here they find some side effects about the source graph from 1980 to 2011 about the CPI inflation rate, and plus 1 year, so it's a realized inflation information 1 year. And that is a black line here, the black and solid line here is the actual inflation rate, the realized inflation rate. And the blue line here is the SPF, is a professional forecaster, mean forecast. So it's the blue line. Blue line here. Professional forecaster. And the median survey of the household mean forecast is the green line here. It's a green line here. It's green line. So it's the household forecast, okay? And the gray areas here is the MD recession time in the US. So in the US, it's beginning of 1980, the recession time, and during time here also time of high inflation in the US with oil price increase, and then we get the high inflation and recession in this time. And then we have a beginning of 1990 recession with the war in the Middle East, and then at the beginning of 2000 yeah, with the dot-com crisis. And then here's the global crisis in 2008.
2008.
So again, tell me what you find in this graph. What is the big picture? You can see for the development of the professional forecast, household forecast, compared with realized inflation and how it will look during this time of economic recession.
The expert forecast always seems to be a lot less volatile, and like it's somewhere like always in a kind of like mid-range.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a less volatile compared with the household survey, with the household expectation, right?
But I saw that at crisis,
Yeah,
The-
recession time.
recession time, the peak of the forecast and the inflation opposite side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see that with the recession time, with the economic growth is low. We also can see that the inflation in general also low, right? The actual inflation rate is low, so it's consistent with the Philip curve, prediction that with kind of high unemployment we expect with the low inflation period. So and the data also confirm that with the time of recession we have a low inflation and high unemployment rate. But during this time we can see that the difference between the professional forecast and also household forecast with the realized inflation, the gap here also in general is larger, right? Especially for the inflation in 2009. But yeah, the people, especially for the household, they expect that inflation will be going up. And professional forecasters, they still hope that inflation is unchanged. But for the household, expect that in this kind of crisis, they're very pessimistic about the future inflation. And they expect high inflation, but it turned out that actual inflation rate is very low and even negative. So it makes a gap between the household inflation expectation and the actual inflation. It's large and bias increase during the time of the recession. So that's why in this paper they want to solve the impacts of the attitude, the consumer attitude about the future macroeconomy with the bias when they make the expectation. Yeah. But on average, when we look at the average inflation expectation in the Michigan survey and the professional forecast, we can see that it's quite close to each other, right? Especially for the 2000, for example, the gap here is quite small. But just from the 2000 here, the gap is larger, and especially during the time of the recession, the gap will also larger between household and professional forecasting. And now we look at the role of the perceived news and the media reporting. So perceived news is in the survey question, they ask one question that have you heard recently price change or not? So and heard new change here is the blue one here, the blue line here is the share people they say that they heard news about the price change. This shall be important. And the green line here is a news story that is a cover in the New York Times and in the Washington Post. And again, the black line here is the real line of the CPI. But maybe the CPI inflation is not about the realized inflation, but it's the actual inflation rate during that time. And what you can see is from this picture. What is the real shift in of this paper? We get into the perceived news. The news is report that they heard about price change recently. And the news published by the newspaper like Washington Post and the New York Times. We can do the CPI inflation as a benchmark here. How both variables will link with the actual inflation rate. And also in this kind of recession.
Almost, I think up to like the year 2000, there seems to be like some kind of like upward bias for the news stories.
No, it's not about upward bias. But the frequency or the intensity of the news, they cover the topic about inflation in the newspaper. So the blue line here is so the intensity of the inflation news in the Washington Post and in the New York Times. So there's no upward bias or
still like I think the overall picture is like all the way to the year 2000. The intensity for the news story is always like above the perceived news.
actually the perceived news and media reporting is a two different scale, right? Because it is one is x-axis and news story is the y-axis, so it's two different news, two different indicators, so we cannot see, can compare weak is more or less compared with the other data, but we just can see the correlation, whether it's positive correlation or negative correlation or no correlation at all. Right? Because here we already so here we can only say about correlation. So first, what is correlation between the news stories and the actual inflation rate?
No significant correlation.
Có mà significant mà.
I think the correlation gets stronger over time.
Yeah, so it's not only about stronger over time, but we can see in general we can see that it's a positive correlation, right? When inflation is high, more media report about the inflation topic, and when inflation going down, the news coverage about inflation also reduce. And then if the inflation is going up, they also report more news about inflation. But yeah, in general, we can say that it's a high positive correlation between the actual inflation rate with the media news, and quite similar with the share of people they say that they heard news about price change. But the main difference here regarding to the recent areas from especially from the middle of 2000 until 2010 here, we can see that a lot of people they report that I heard price change, but the inflation is low, or even in this time of recession here, still in the time of the global financial crisis, the people heard a lot of news about price change, but actually the actual inflation here has become deflation and negative. So there's something different about how people report their perception of price change, and that is fun. So the perceived news about the increasing or decreasing price, because of price change here, it could be that the price increase or decrease, right? So the important means that it's the same thing. But if we separate the share of people they report that price increase or decrease in two different lines here. So the blue line here is the share of people they report that they heard price decreasing, and the green lines here is the share of people they report that they heard news about the price increase. Okay? And now we can see that the share of people they report price decreasing is almost close to zero and very stable, right? So almost no one they report that I heard price reduce. That's likely, and also consistent with the story that the price is almost stable and or increase. So, but if the question, if they report about the price change, they mostly is about the price increasing in the share, and the development of the share people, they report that price increase is quite consistent with the price level, the actual CPI. And now, one more thing. If we look at the gasoline price inflation and the perceived news about price increase, now we can see that the gasoline price inflation here is black line, it's a green, blue line here, and the orange here, when the price the gasoline is increased at zero, so only positive gasoline price here is the actual gasoline price here is increased, and the black line here is the share people they report that they heard about price increasing. And And now we can see that it's very strong correlation, right, between the gasoline price increase and the share of people they report that they heard news about the price increase. So consistent with our results that we look at in the previous paper, verify that when people perform expectation, they look at some selling price like fuel or gasoline price, right? So if they just observe that some price change in gasoline or gasoline price, they report in the survey that I put about news about the price increase, but it's just about the gasoline price, not about the whole basket of the CPI. So again, gasoline price is an important factor for people when they form and they report about prices. Yeah. Now we have more evidence for the story. So in the previous paper, we looked at the user fact survey, and now we look at the median survey with data back to 1980, and more questions about the report about the news perception. And one more graph before we look at the regression result, that is they have consumer attitude about purchasing like vehicles, vehicle, and house are the three main big items of households. And here the question is that they ask now it's a good time to buy a house or to buy a vehicle, to buy durable goods. And if they say that now it's not a good time or bad time to do so, it means that they are pessimistic about the future economic conditions. And here is the share of how it develop over time. And we can see that it's a quite strongly correlated to each other, right? If they're pessimistic about durable goods, they're also pessimistic about vehicle and house. Now it's a good time to buy. And if the share here is larger during the recession time, you can see that it's an increase during the time of recession. So it means that during the time of recession, more people were pessimistic about the purchasing attitude. Okay, now we look at the inflation bias. So inflation bias here, there are two main measures of inflation bias. One, inflation expectation bias. Here, P here is there are two indicators for that. P here is when we compare the inflation expectation with the realized inflation, the realized actual inflation rate. That is one. And the second indicator is that we look at the difference between household inflation expectation with professional forecaster expectation. So it's an F here is a professional forecaster. Okay. So we have two independent variables that is to measure how bias household inflation expectation. And then we run with different variables here. For example, the CI here is a household characteristic, like if they're pessimistic about financial issues, or if they're pessimistic about the macroeconomy, or if they're pessimistic about the attitude to buy the major items. And news feed here is if they heard news about the prices, so the perception of prices from the household survey. And news M here is the intensity of the news about inflation coverage in the newspaper like Washington Post and the New York Times. And then we look at the impression of this variable to see house bias here driven by the household attitude about the economy and the role of the news report about the prices and the news coverage about inflation topic.
So CI Times News is like innovation?
The CI, household characteristic like now it's good time to buy the mobile and combine with the news report about the budget or the news coverage by the newspaper about inflation. And here is the main regression of the table of the paper. They look at the determinants of bias related to actual inflation rate. So the bias here is measured by the inflation expectation with the realized inflation of the realized actual inflation rate. Okay. And here we have a little measure of the consumer attitude about the financial situation, the income boost of next month, relating to financial situation of financial expectation and non-expected income, whether it increase or decrease, and here is financial situation income boost. All the figures of the macroeconomy in the next column here. And if the expect that the unemployment is become higher, or the next block here is about watching attitudes about bedtime for physical virtues or house virtues and legal virtues. And other factors here like relating to the incomes, like income up to 20% or below or below. So the first line here is about household characteristic, and news B here is the report about the put some news about prices, and news N here is the news coverage by the newspaper about inflation. Yeah. And the others here is about inflation of the household characteristic and perception about news and the news coverage by newspaper. So yeah, now you have 1 minute to look at this tables, and then we discuss about themselves together. What this shall we? The structure of this table is a little bit difficult to understand, but I think this is the best way for them to report many results together.
Interaction, news,
Can you come up with the interpretation table? For example, the first one, the first estimated coefficient here, what does it mean? About 0.167, what does it mean? How to interpret this number? If we understand how to interpret this number, we can interpret all the other ones. And here's the financial situation. It's the compare with the demonstrate where the financial situation is worse or better. And here is among those who have financial situation is worse compared with the past year one, and financial expectation is compared with next year one. And next one is expected income is decreasing. But first look at this one.
Characteristic is a dummy variable, like one for an optimistic and two for
Exactly.
pessimistic.
It's dummy variable for those who if people one if they are more pessimistic about the future.
One is pessimistic.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're pessimistic, so that will increase rho 0.167. Like they would the bias between their predictions and the realized inflation would be different by 0.167.
Yeah, exactly. It's increased right compared with those who optimistic
Yeah.
about the financial situation by the 0.167%, right? So yeah, now we got it, and everyone else also got it. Yeah, so if we are if household they are pessimistic about their financial situation here, the bias about the expectation compared with the actual inflation rate increased by 0.167% compared with those who optimistic about financial situation. Okay. And now if we look at other variables here, like financial expectation or expected income, we also can see that if the people they are more pessimistic about other factors here, they also have an upward, more upward bias, right? Regarding to the actual interest rate. Okay? So it's the first column here. The first row here is so that everyone who is pessimistic about the financial situation or macroeconomic condition or pursuing attitude for major item, right? If they're pessimistic about them, they are more likely to have more upward bias about inflation expectation compared with the actual inflation rate. Okay?
Yeah.
So that's the first result. And the second result is here regarding to the news perception. If they report what they put about price change, and as we know that if they report about the price change, it means that it's more likely that they report about the price increase, right, or the price increase of the past year. So in this case, if they report that they put news about price change, again we also have upward bias here by 1.3 or 1.39%, right?
But if they, but with the next coefficient, so if the person is pessimistic, so it's reduce the bias, right?
No.
The next one.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's the next one, but now yeah, but in here. But now we just focus on this one first. If they report that they heard news about climate change, they become more upward bias.
Yeah.
About climate change, and the magnitude of the effect here is large. So it's about 1.4% or 1.2%, and it's consistent across all the demographic here, right? And yeah, so that's first thing, one more point. And now if we look at the interaction between the household characteristics with those who report that they heard price change. And if we look at all the regression here, we can see that some of them are insignificant, but in some case it becomes significant and positive, right? So we can say that if they pessimistic about financial issues or the macroeconomy, and if they report they heard price change, they are more likely that they increase the upward bias or doesn't change. item here relating to the news coverage by newspaper about inflation topic. So if the newspaper, the intensity of news about inflation by the newspaper is increased, what impact on the buyers? What is the impact of the news coverage and in the newspaper?
The coverage will like strengthen the strength of whether the people actually hear the news.
We don't know. We don't know about whether they actually read the news from the newspaper or not. But the news intensity here is also aggregate data for everyone. So the news and here is the intensity index of the newspaper. They cover topic about inflation. And now if the intensity here is increased, the bias here you can see that is the increase, right? So if the newspaper they talk more about inflation, for example, the bias between the expectation and the actual inflation rate now is reduced. Yeah? So that means that if the media they talk more about inflation, it means that people become more informed about the price level, right? And that could lead to the lower bias or less bias about future inflation. And
can I ask, like, the unit of the bias, we exclude the percentage already, right?
yeah,
Okay, so it's like, for example, like, the new one is 3.5. So with the news, like, they will have, like, they might expect it to be 3 only, lower than the real inflation rate, 0.5%.
0.5.
Around 0.5, right? Minus 0.5.
Which is 0.5? Here.
Yeah, for 498.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 0.5. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
So for example, if the news coverage here increased by 1 unit, the household will reduce their bias by 0.5 percentage point. Okay, about their bias. So with more news and if the media they talk more about inflation, the bias here is reduced. So and you can see that it's quite consistent across all models. And now, if those with the pessimistic household characteristic here, if they heard news, not heard news, but when we take the impression effects here, we also can see that the bias here also reduced in many situations like with the expected income, it's reduced, but the media has more on this topic, the bias here also reduced by 0.182%, and also with as well. So what does it mean here? If the people they report that I heard price change or price increase, the bias with actual inflation rate will be increased. And if the media they talk more about inflation, the bias here can reduce. So the implication of communication from the central bank is that the central bank they talk more about inflation, and then the media they also talk more about inflation. The bias between the expectation and the realized inflation will be lower. That is how communication can work to and the media room to fit the bias of the household. And if the household they are pessimistic about the future, they're also more pessimistic about inflation, right? If they're pessimistic about the financial issues, or pessimistic about the macroeconomy, or pessimistic about the virtual attitude, they also have a higher bias about the inflation, or the expected inflation rate is higher than the actual inflation rate. And the result also very similar if we look at the bias here relatively to the professional forecaster, and these are almost the same. And just to confirm that the result about the biodisponibility to the professional forecaster and the actual equation rate is very much similar. Okay. So,
Can you also interpret the test 1 and test 2?
test one and test two.
The role of test 1 and test 2, the meaning of that?
Yeah. So here we want to test where the use here and use here is plus here equals 0, right?
Yeah.
So, and they also test
Sometimes
4 and
Positive
7 here.
inflation.
For some here equals 0. Yeah. So just one or two minutes for everyone to think about that and tell me what to think about that. Yeah, that's a good point. Any ideas about how to interpret step number 1 and step number 2? Just idea. How to interpret test number 1 and test number 2? And what is the idea? What is the purpose of test number 1 and test number 2? First, what is the purpose of test number 1? Yeah, anyone?
So I think like because the characteristic is dummy variable is a 1 or 2, so the total the sum of alpha 3 and alpha 6 is the effect of the use t, like whether you heard about the inflation or not on the pessimistic people, because that is yeah.
So test number 1 here is alpha 3 plus alpha 6, right?
Yeah. So it's like the total effect of the news you heard from someone else about the change of the prices for the pessimistic.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the optimistic is already alpha 3.
Yeah.
The optimistic do not have the alpha 6. The interaction there will be 0.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, that's why I've just asked the question about the coefficient, the value of alpha 6, because I saw that there is the test for alpha 3 and alpha 6 over there, and I saw that is significant. I mean, reject the non-hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that although the alpha 6 is not significant here, but because of the test, so we can say that it still have the impact on the pessimistic group.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
related
exactly.
to the positive inflation news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So the points here they want to estimate whether the difference between the points of the stats here is to solve the difference between the pessimistic and the optimistic regarding to the news perception. Yeah, whether it's significantly different or not. Yeah, and the same thing for this one. For the test number 2 regarding to the news perception. Yes, that's a very good point that you mentioned so that we understand a little bit more about the. Okay. Very good point. And so now we move to the next topic about the effects of inflation expectation for economic diseases. So we know that in the Euler equation, right, or in the AS curve, in the McKinsey models, we know that household perception of the real interface affects that kind of consumption and saving diseases. And this topic is particularly relevant during the time of the zero low now when the normal interface is fixed or unchanged. So only thing that changes inflation, real interface is driven by inflation expectation, right? So that's why we can study the role of inflation expectation on consumption and saving diseases. And it's also important for the central bank when during this time during the time of zero low bound, they use forward guided policy to manage people's expectation about the future economy, including inflation. But the question here is that whether households' macroeconomic expectation obtained from survey data really relevant for their actual economic decision making. So that's where the Euler equation here is works in the data or not. We know for theory it's for sure that if inflation is increased, the current spending is increased, but now we need to use data to check the theory whether it works or not. So it's my paper with Lina Dreger, and it's also my first chapter of my PhD. And as I mentioned, this paper I work at the term paper in our course like this one 7 or 8 years ago. Yeah, I used as a term paper, and then I joined the paper with Lina Dreger. She used the handbook survey approach expectation, and at the time I used the US Bank survey approach expectation, but we addressed the same question. So after my term paper, I submitted to her and I asked her for some suggestion I can develop my term paper to become a chapter in my PhD, and she asked me whether I want to join her to write a paper together about this topic, but we used 2 different data sets from the handbook survey approach expectation and the US Bank survey approach expectation. So that is how it works. So very brief about the Euler equation here, and I asked her that we know from the ESGE model that the household optimize consumption over the life cycle and prefer to smooth consumption over time. So that's why we have current consumption here is equal to expected consumption and minus sigma power minus 1 and time with IT normal interest rate minus expected inflation in this area. Okay, so it's sigma power minus 1 as a equal temporal substitution electricity and the below of the process. And if we look at this equation, we can see that the current consumption here is not impacted, influenced by the expected interest rate, right? Because expected interest rate here is no expectation here. So the actual interest rate and only the role of expected inflation. But the thing here is that if we solve forward this equation number 1 here, but we solve forward, we can see that the expected inflation here also play a role in the second equation here. So, for example, in this equation 1 here, but now we just change it here. For example, CP plus 1 equal to ET and CP plus 2 minus this one and IT plus 1 minus expected inflation in the T plus 2,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And if we will continue to do so for the 12 months
Oh.
consecutively, for example, here we assume that it's a monthly data, for example, and then we do it for the next 12 months, and then we have 1 year, right?
Oh.
And in this way, we can have the formula that expected the current consumption of this month equal to the on average of 12 months. We can do the expected consumption and the expected interest rate as well. So in the second equation here, we find that the expected interest rate here also play a role to explain the current consumption, right? But in the Euler equation here, the original equation here, the expected interest rate play no role in explaining the current consumption, right? But if we show it forward in this way, we can show that the expected inflation here also play a role in explaining the current consumption. So that is how we look from the Euler equation of the IS curve to explain expected inflation also play a role in explaining the current consumption. Okay? So when we start this paper, we only have this one, but we use this equation number 1, and we explain that the expected inflation rate will also impact on the current inflation, current consumption. And the referee report, they say that now look at the Euler equation here, we do not find the effect of expected interest rate on current consumption. So how we can interpret the result? And then when we think about that question and we look at the literature and we recognize that it is so important equation for the next 12 months, we can develop with the next equation like equation number 2. And based on equation number 2, again, now we can explain that expected inflation will also play a role to explain current consumption. But in the first version of our paper, when we submit to the journal, we don't have an equation number 2 here. We just have the first one. And the referee, they critique us. If we look at the original Euler equation, there no role expected interest rate to explain the current consumption, right? So that is how the paper works all the time. Okay. So the next question, developed in our paper here is that still here from the Euler equation, that is the current consumption is a function of expected consumption and still the Euler equation. But now we need to know how to measure current consumption, right? And how to measure expected consumption. And for interest rate and expected inflation is clear already. But when we use survey data to ask people about how much you spend over the past 12 months, right? The way that people they answer this question more or less about the nominal spending, right? It's not about the real spending. But both variable here is a real spending, right? In the Euler equation or in the theoretical model, both variables here is a real variable. But in the survey data, we only can ask people about the nominal spending, or even that we ask about how much to spend over the past 12 months. The people can only tell you about the nominal term, right? Because if you ask them like how much you spend over the past 12 months in real term, for example, people cannot understand and what is real term here, right? So in this case, we need to transform the nominal term in terms of the real term.
By the
Right?
price.
To test Euler equation, we need to transform the nominal term into real term. And then how we can do that? So here is real term, but here is nominal variable that we can measure, right? So this is what we can measure. So we can transform the theoretical models in equation 3 here into the CT here now is equal to CT nominal minus PT, right? So PT here is the price level. It's not about inflation, but it's price level. And so if we minus PT here, so it means that in this equation, so minus PD, and expected consumption here also equal to the expected nominal spending and minus to the expected price level in the next period, right? So expected CD plus 1 will equal to this one. Okay? And everything will be unchanged. And now we just restructure the equation here a little bit. We put PP here on the right-hand side here. And now we have a CP nominal here. That's a function of expected consumption in nominal term. And then we can break down this equation into IT, the nominal interest rate, and expected inflation. And here we also have the expected price level minus to the price level, the current price level, right? So now we transform the equation in this one. And then now, and the difference between the price level in this period and the current period, here we have the PT plus 1, right? And PT plus 1 here, and then here we also have the sigma minus 1 here, the same as the expected PT plus 1, and then the final equation here will be like this one, right? So here is what we can measure. We only can measure the CP nominal, and we measure this one is nominal as well. And now we can study the impact of inflation expectation here on the CP nominal. And the parameter we estimate will be like this one and this one about interest rate expectation. And now we can show it forward with this equation for the next term like this one, the same as before. But here now we can have the CP nominal here in expected spending in the next term, and also expected interest rate and expected inflation. Right? I just show you forward. So now we can see that both expected inflation and expected interest rate also play a role in explaining the current consumption in nominal term. Okay?
So since it is for monthly, right? Monthly spending.
Yeah, for the monthly spending and the current spending for the and then we can put the equation in terms of the economic techniques that we estimate the current spending on expected spending and expected interest rate and expected inflation, and here we control for demographic. And we test where the beta 1 is positive because the consumption is moving over time, and beta 2 is negative because the interest rate here is a negative coefficient, right? And beta 3 here is a positive. But actually the result really depends on whether this one is larger than 1 or not. So that's why we explain that in the result. Sometimes it could be positive or negative. It depends on the magnitude of the interchangeable electricity, whether it larger one or smaller than 1. So it depends on different contexts and for different households and different interchangeable substitutions. So that the effect of inflation expectation on nominal spending would be mixed. Sometimes it could be positive or negative. And then we test for the role of financial literacy and use on monetary policy and financial markets as well. Okay, so we use survey data at the University of Hamburg, and this is a representative survey of the German population. In the main data, we use this one, and in the appendix, we saw this out of Bundesbank survey of consumer expectation. And we do 2 ways during the zero low bound in 2015 with the 300 interview, and in May and June, so 6 months later, we interviewed nearly 200 people. And there was a question about spending and inflation and credit expectation. But you can see that, so this one, the sample size is very small, right? So at that time, so just 10 years ago, exactly now it's 10 years ago, that the survey is conducted 10 years ago, and the sample size is small, and it is a telephone survey. So it's not online survey, but it's a telephone survey, so it's very expensive. And with the sample size here is very small, so it's impossible to publish a paper, a subtype paper at the moment, because most papers at the moment here they use thousand observation or much more. The sample size much larger than the time we conduct the survey. But why is still able to publish this paper? Because this time is one of the first they look at the survey data and the link of inflation expectation with the spending is easy. So that's why it's small sample size, but it's one of the first working on that direction. So that's why the paper still accepted at the moment at the very top corner at that time. But now if we conduct similar research and we just do such kind of sample size, it's impossible for you or for us to publish this paper anymore. So it's one of the pioneers. Yeah. So here's the question we asked about how to measure the kind of consumption. Like this one, because we have some qualitative measurement of spending, and like how do you say the total expenditure in the past German compared to an average year in the past, whether it's considerably higher or about the same or considerably lower, right? So three category of no or no answer. And for expected spending, we also ask the same question, but we ask about next term compared to an average year in the past. So for non-interface, we also ask about qualitative. So interface or saving account interface of next term and qualitative. And in the second wave of our survey, so in the first wave we do not answer about quantitative, but in the second wave we ask about quantitative interface expectation. Like what we think and how high we interface on saving accounts on average of the German and that they use number here. But we only ask in the second wave, not in the first wave. And for inflation expectation, we also add qualitative and quantitative. So very similar to the things we studied so far. But keep in mind that in this survey we ask for the price in general, not inflation. That is something we did about 10 years ago, before the survey of ECB and also before the Bundesbank survey. So that's why we are one of the first in Europe working on that direction. And that's why this paper is not accepted. At that time, the data is very limited. So that's why the people they appreciate and support this this paper. Yeah, we also asked about inflation perception of the West German, both qualitative and quantitative. And now here, now here's the results for the and also the main result for this. So here we ask we use a whole sample size. The first one is the expected spending, and the next one is the interface expectation in terms of qualitative, and the third row here is the expected interface in quantitative, and expected inflation qualitative measurement and expected inflation in quantitative measurement. And the dependent variables here is, of course, is the current spending. Okay, so we estimate the current spending on expected spending, interface expectation, and inflation expectation to see whether it's consistent with the oil equation, and we control for all other demographic and macro expectation as well in this paper. And the first result here we can see the very positive correlation between expected spending with the current spending. assumption in the Euler equation. But for interest rate expectation, we did not find the impact or significant impact of interest rate expectation on the current spending. But for inflation expectation, we will find that if they expect higher inflation, they also have a higher current spending. So it's consistent with the Euler equation. And now, if we look at the growth of financial literacy, so now the first three columns here, we look at the whole sample size, and the next three columns here we look at the group of high financial literacy only. Those who answer correctly all three questions about financial literacy. And now we can see that the impact of interest rate expectation on spending become significant. So, and the magnitude of the impact of inflation expectation on spending here also significant, the magnitude is also larger. So it means for those with high financial literacy, they react more strongly and more consistently with the Euler equation. Right? So, and this is why we find that financial literacy is important for the household decision making. So that's why in our next project I presented yesterday about the role of financial literacy on the formation of inflation expectation. Right? So it's come from this project, and we believe financial literacy is something very special when the household they make financial decisions. And that's why we continue with another project after this one to study the cause and effect of financial literacy on the formation of inflation expectation as I presented yesterday. But it's a storyline, so how one thing come up after the other. Okay. Yeah, and we also can estimate not only for current spending, for total spending, but we also can look at the mechanisms and on durable things as well. Now the measurement of spending, not about total spending, but the attitude about durable spending. Now is good time to buy major item. And the results here we find that the negative correlation between the expected inflation with the attitude to buy durable things is negative, and so consistent with other literature. They also find that if the people that expect higher inflation, they are less likely to make decisions about major purchases because they be more pessimistic about the future income, or because of that they don't want to. They're less likely to buy the big items. And few more things just regarding to the IV approach, the interim variables, because as I said, for all the results here, it's just about the correlation, right? Because there are no structural models or no interim variables, so every referees they discuss about whether the results here is cause effect or not. Right? So it's a limitation of this study, subtype study, and they ask for some interim variable to make sure that the result here is somehow cause effect, right? And it's always challenging for the micro data and for the available survey data set, for the cross-sectional survey data. But we also have some interim variable after the referee report. We develop some interim variable, so we can use inflation perception as the instrument for inflation expectation. Because why we can do that? Good. So if we look at the Euler equation here, we find that inflation perception, right, have no role to explain the current inflation of the current standard, right? So inflation perception, no role to explain the current spending, and only expected inflation play a role to explain the current spending, right? So if inflation perception has some effect on current spending, it goes through the expected inflation. And in the graph, we see in the previous paper, they find that strong correlation between inflation perception here, right? Strong correlation between perception with how people form expectations, right? So we can use inflation perception here as the instrument variable for inflation expectation, because inflation perception can have significant impact on inflation expectation, and then no direct effect of inflation perception on the current spending based on the typical model. So in that way, we can use perception as the instrument variable for the expected inflation. But actually, in our first version, when we submit to the journal, we also estimate the effect of inflation perception on current spending. And the referee, they critique us, look at this equation. There is no role of inflation perception on current spending. Why we estimate, Rice author estimate the effect of inflation perception on current spending? So we use such kind of suggestion and criticism, and we use perception as instrument for expected inflation. And then, luckily, we worked. So it's a story again about how we do the referee report and how we learn from the referee report to make paper stronger over time. So at the first version, there are a lot of criticism, but then we use suggestion from the referee report, and then we, based on their critics, and then we think, and then we use perception here as an instrument variable for expected inflation, and then the referee they accept that strategy. So it's how the paper develop over time. The first version and the last version and publication is very much different, but it's how it develop over time and how we learn from that. Yeah, that's one thing. And another strategy that we can use instrument variable is that in the literature, they also show that if we have a multiple different way to measure the same thing, like inflation expectation here, we can use one of the measurement as the instrument for the others. For example, if we measure the qualitative inflation expectation here, but using qualitative and quantitative, right? That is two different ways to measure the same thing about inflation expectation. So we can use one of the indicator as the instrument for the other. And in that way, we can use the instrument variable that to estimate the causal effect of inflation expectation on current spending. And that suggestion is in the first version is not in the paper. And but during we present at the conference and the discussion on our paper, they suggest that we can use the qualitative measurement of inflation expectation as the instrument for quantitative expectation. So it's not from our own idea, but from the discussion in the conference, and they suggest us to improve the paper by using the instrument variable that either using qualitative as instrument for quantitative or the other way around. And again, it works. So it also is how it developed through the referee report and also through the conference when we present for different people and we have different views and discussion from the audience, and then we can improve paper. So it's a very long process, but it improves over time until the end of the paper, that is in terms of the publication. So that is a storyline one more time. Yeah. So here's a sample district that we do the instrument variable approach with for the information, and all these are we find here is consistent with the baseline result to confirm that our result is correct. And the last result here we look at the role of monetary news. If the people they heard news about monetaries or not, and we look at the impact of inflation expectation on current spending. And for example, if you look at this graph, we can see that the effect of inflation expectation on current spending is stronger for those who report that they heard some monetary news when they think go to the doctor and news about monetary policy. So here again, the oil regulation become more consistent for those who heard news from the central bank or news from monetary policy or financial market. And that is another strategy and another thing come up to it. We really find the role of central bank communication on the economic decision of the household. So that's why our next step after this paper, we look at the role of central bank communication on the formation of inflation expectation. So it convinced us that yes, good news from the central bank or news in the financial market was important for the household when they form expectation and when they make economic decisions. But at the moment, it does some correlation. It's not about the causal effect, right? So our next step after this paper is to identify some causal effect of central bank communication on the formation of inflation expectation. That is a thing I will present in next week for you as well. So it's process how we start the idea and how the idea is developed over time and how different projects is come up after some original idea. We need to put the data to convince ourselves that something is important, right? Otherwise, we just look at some textbook or some research paper from the others, but it only changes my mind or our ideas once we work with the real data to feel and have some real feeling about how data works. Otherwise, we always have some skeptical whether the survey data measurement is works or not, whether it's reliable or of course there are a lot of discussion about the quality of the data and whether we can analyze the survey data for actual economic decisions. But once we work with the survey data and not only one survey data but many different survey data, and we find something with a common point and with consistent to each other, and then our belief increase over time. So at the first few years when I worked on this topic, I was very much hesitating to ask my friends or my families about what do you think about inflation, because I think that is something weird. But nowadays I'm very much confident when I ask people what do you think about inflation in the next moment, and I can tell you what is the story behind that and why you think about that. And I find that is interesting. It convinced me over time. But at the beginning, like this time when we study and just find something that's interesting, but also a lot of skepticism. Because it's a process of thinking, right? We cannot believe something just by looking or first time we experience that, but it develops over time. Yeah, so that is for this morning, and in this afternoon I will continue with another paper by central bank communication and the formation of expectation. Okay, so we can stop here.